We used to listen to the American Forces Network. I think it was broadcasting from Munich. And there was a certain amount of jazz on the BBC, but mostly of the earlier jazz. The thing about AFN was that it was the things that were happening there and then, as they were happening. And that's what made it exciting. But I still had this prejudice about jazz as though it were some kind of inferior music and didn't stand up in quality to classical music. And that was really a prejudice that was instilled in me as a child, not, I think, from any one source. It was just sort of the general cultural opinion. The classical music was real music, and all the other was sort of secondary in a way, and certainly educationalists frowned on jazz as being some kind of inferior product that was decadent in a way. I can remember one of the things at the school concert where one of the visiting teachers got up and said, well, it's so nice to hear an orchestra with violins. We don't want those ugly instruments like saxophones, do we, you see? Now, as a kid, that affects you because you've got nothing to judge it by, and so I was prejudiced against jazz. I learned to play the violin at school, and I joined the school orchestra and so forth. But to me, the violin was always at a disadvantage because I wanted to play with other musicians, and apart from the practicing on my own at home and then once a week with the school orchestra, it was kind of empty. So we had an old piano that I used to fiddle around with, and I got hold of a piano tutor, and from what I knew of the violin, I started to learn the bass clef and began to get the hang of the piano. Now, on those old tutors, the chords were really laid out very simply, and there was no actual chord structure as such, but I began to recognize patterns, and although as a kid I couldn't have given names to them, they were really the essence of learning the chordal aspect of harmony. But because it was the war years and there were very few musicians around, there were so many gigs, I soon got the hang of it and began to work extensively. And by the time I was 16, the first real family squabbles occurred because at 16 I found myself earning more than my old man, and that didn't help for the harmony in the home, as it were. My father used to play piano. My mother played violin in a very limited way. And oft-time as a kid, you know, after I'd gone to bed, I'd hear my father playing the piano, and that I always loved to hear him. He played like classics and things, you know. And he was no great musician, but he loved the music, and I could hear that in the playing. So it was natural, really, for me to want to play. I just enjoyed it. Looking back on it, it would have been much better for me if I'd have had some real training at that stage, but I didn't, you know, so that's the way it went. By the time I was 16 and working in gigs and that, I enrolled in the Trinity College of Music in London as a part-time student. And I studied with a man called Douglas Muse, who became one of the main people of that college. And he obviously took an interest in me, although I didn't recognize it at the time. In fact, I used to be scared to go in for a lesson because if I hadn't practiced much, I would think, you know, he was really going to get irate. And when I finally quit, I realized how he was quite disappointed because he obviously saw something in me. But by that time, 16, 17, I'd picked up a bass and was started to learn to play that and was gigging around. And then when the chance came to work on the liners between Southampton and New York, I took that and I worked for 18 months on the Queen Mary. And that's what introduced me to the New York Jazz. And by that time I was away, and that's where I wanted to be. I first got to New York in 1949. The music was so inspiring. I'd never heard anything like it. This was the way to play music. Instinctively, I loved it. But I also had a kind of guilt feeling about it, like it wasn't proper classical music, and church music was proper music, and this was kind of, you know, raunchy, loose, not quite right somehow, but because I loved it so much, I thought, well, that's what I enjoy, you know. By the time I started work on the Queen Mary, I'd been a professional musician for a number of years, and I'd already had the experience of doing broadcasts on the BBC and doing concert work and so forth, and had already begun to make a reputation as a bass player, as a young up-and-coming jazz bass player in this country. So I kind of felt my oats, even though maybe my abilities were not that well developed, but I already had a certain amount of acclaim, so I began to feel like, you know, somebody to be reckoned with. I soon learned that I had a lot more to learn, a lot longer to go before I could really use that reputation. Most people in the late 40s, very few traveled by air. I mean, the Duke of Windsor, Duke and Duchess of Windsor used to come across on that boat. I remember Eartha Kitt coming across, Nat King Cole with his trio. So many celebrities, film and stage celebrities and politicians and so forth. So we used to get either to see them or to know them, or it was like living a life quite different than what I had known before. And already, I suppose subconsciously, I was beginning to see the English culture as somewhat stilted, and what with the rationing during the war, which went on, of course, after the war for some years, England seemed a very grey and uninviting place. And after seeing New York and all those lights and the life there and the electric energy that's part of New York and still is to this day, I couldn't but want to be there. And I think many of the musicians that I worked with had the same desire. Not all of them decided to go over, but a number did. I mean, George Shearing went over. He went over before I did. Ralph Sharon, who then has become the accompanist and arranger for Tony Bennett. Some other jazz musicians, Derek Smith, Ronnie Ball, quite a number emigrated to the States and made a reputation in music. But when I got to New York, this famous jazz street, 52nd Street, was still in existence. 1949, it was going strong. By 1950, it began to go, and they began to demolish all those brownstone houses which had housed these little jazz clubs. So the decay had already set in. But in 1949, it was just magic. And we used to go from club to club. There was so much music to hear. I mean, you could go in one club and hear Billie Holiday. You could go in another club and hear Charlie Parker with Bud Powell. The person that influenced me most at that time was the piano player Lenny Tristano. He had an entirely new approach to jazz playing. In a way, it probably was closer to a classical tradition, although Lenny would have been horrified if I'd have described it as that. But it appealed to me because the musicality, their approach to playing, their dedication to it was much closer to, I suppose, the European tradition, and that got to me more so than any of the other music at that time. Another thing is that Lenny had been quite a strong influence as a teacher. So a number of us started to take lessons with him while we were still working on the boat. So every 2 weeks we get into New York and have a lesson with Lenny, and he really, more than anyone, influenced me in how much there was in jazz, and also that it was not just a matter of just letting go and playing a bunch of notes, but there was a tremendous discipline behind it. And so from that time on, that has been my music more than anything else. my opinion, is the music that came out of the 50s and even the 40s. That's where the vocabulary was developed and where the great pioneering occurred. And yeah, we may lose it for a while, we may lose it for 50 years, but because of recordings, people will come back to it, and eventually I think there'll be a reappraisal. I think the understanding of the artistry and the beauty, a lot of it is too complex for people. People want something simpler, and so they're getting to a simpler level of the music. So people pick up on the licks, on the kind of approach to it, but they don't yet realize the depth of creativity, in my opinion. I think in years to come we'll go back to and we'll say, that was a fantastic era. Now, I was fortunate because I went to New York and caught at least the tail end of that era and really began to understand and actually heard it. So my memories, both visual and musical memories of what went on, they keep me going today. I never ever thought I'd leave New York. That to me was be my home for life. And I still think of it as home. But going back is a little scary because although I know the city, the social scene has changed so much, but still it's an exciting city. It's a lovely city to be in, you know. I'd been there for about 10 years or more. I got quite seriously ill with mononucleosis. It's a kind of one of those jaundice-related diseases. And I think from just burning the candle both ends for too long, you know, I mean, I hardly used to sleep in those days. Eventually it caught up with me. By that time I'd met my wife, and although we weren't together that time, you know, there was a romance. She had gone to England on a vacation, an extended vacation, and we corresponded, and I came back to England, albeit briefly, but mostly to convalesce. After spending that year, that was 1962, in England, by that time I was married and had a baby daughter, and then we went back to the USA again. One of the things that I became aware of when I first went to New York and studied with Lenny Tristano was the essence of rhythm, and particularly of learning cross rhythms, how one rhythm overlaps on another. And then later on I began to realize the identity in relationship between rhythm and harmony. But Lenny used to have us studying beating 2 against 3, 3 against 4, 3 against 5, 4 against 5, and so forth. And it took a lot of discipline to master that. And I remember one night when the drummer Al Levitt came in, we used to play all night at Lenny's studio in downtown Manhattan. And one rainy Saturday night, Al comes in all excited and said, "I've just got off the crosstown bus," and his wipers were going 4 against 5, and he didn't even know it. On a simple level, if we play just an interval of a perfect fifth, say a C and G on the piano, and you can try it if you record it, and then slow it down many, many times. You can do it with a 2-speed recorder. You slow it down once and then re-record that and slow it down. And eventually you can hear not an interval of a perfect fifth, but you hear a rhythm. And the rhythm is 2 against 3, one of the simplest rhythms in music. So the intervals correspond to rhythms of varying complexity. So there is this identity, a functional identity between rhythm and harmony. And then this goes into the world of color. If we take the interval of the diminished fifth, which was used so much in bebop particularly, and if we look at that interval and look at its relationship in terms of vibration, it's like complementary colors. So when the Impressionists painted, if they painted a green field or a tree, they use the complementary to stress the liveness, and that complementary is in nature, and it's like a way of expressing nature with a fullness that the normal palette of just saying, well, that's green, I'll just paint green, would never convey. So again, music, art, color, harmony, rhythm, all these have identical and interrelated laws. If you get, say, an art critic and he analyzes a painting, now he may see things in that and analyze things which are quite correct that the artist never realized. I mean, I think at some point in his life, D.H. Lawrence was told that his the Lady Chatterley's Lover contained so much symbolism of the modern era, but he said when he wrote it, he never thought of it in those terms. It just came out naturally what he wanted to write. And what I find is whether I'm playing or painting, I'm not conscious in that sense, but all these insights that have come to me over the years, they add to that ability to be intuitive. For example, if you're playing jazz and you're playing on a chord sequence, if you get inspired, it's so much better if you really know that sequence, because you can let go much deeper. But if you don't know the sequence and you start to stretch out and all of a sudden you panic because it's like that fear of letting it out. But if you know, if you've done the work, you've done your homework, and you really know your music, you can allow the music to flow as though you weren't in charge at all. It just comes from you as an inspiration. So all the discipline that one can muster is important, I think, and all the knowledge about harmonies in music and in art and about cosmic law, all this, it helps to be intuitive. And it's not a hindrance. It's only a hindrance when you're learning, because if you stop and thinking, I'd like to play this, and then you hesitate because you think, well, no, maybe that's not lawful, then it's like the old saying of the centipede, which leg did he move first? And he became paralyzed. So all the study is like, that's grist to the mill. But when you come to play or paint, no thinking, just let it come out. That's the way I approach it. Charlie Parker is noted when he started to play and he started to work at it, and he was sort of booed off the stand, and he went home and worked at it. And I've got a tape of him, an interview with him, and a lot of people thought, well, he was just a natural, like a natural genius. And he said, quite sort of off the cuff, he said, well, yeah, he said, for a few years, he said, I really used to play maybe 12, 15 hours a day. In fact, the neighbors were trying to get my mother to move because they couldn't stand it. He said, yeah, I did that for a few years, he said. Too many people think if they just give a bunch of monkeys enough typewriters and they'll produce a novel. It's much quicker to actually sit down and study your art and be disciplined. And part of the discipline later on means in learning to let go and trust in what you've learned. The challenge for the jazz musician is to create what I describe as an open-ended symmetry. that no matter where it goes, it still has its symmetry. And it's only sometimes it's such a challenge, and sometimes the musician can't hold it and he's got to break it off because either it's too exciting or it gets beyond him. But that's the challenge, is to create that open-ended symmetry. The pop revolution, generally speaking, the music is not, with few exceptions, it hasn't been on a very high level, but it has certainly woken the world up to music in general. And it's far better, I think, to go through that kind of revolutions than stick to sort of the majority of people being totally tone deaf and a few people with a kind of snobbish attitude towards what they think is good music. You know, I'd rather see these revolutions like the pop revolution happen, but because I'm interested in jazz and it's fascinated me, obviously, that's where my enthusiasm lies. One of the problems we have is the recognition of what is great. Because if somebody comes along and say they learn the idiom and they learn it real well, they may be able to entertain, but it could be that nothing actually sparks. No real creativity takes place. For example, you can go to a symphony concert and everything is written out. And afterwards you can come out and say, well, that was very nice. And occasionally you'll get some magic, it may be, and often is, the conductor. And suddenly the music sounds electrifying. When it's really happening, the musician is on the edge with the audience, and there's that excitement that creates, it's like, it doesn't finish, it just continues to explore. The symmetry evolves. In 1962, we went back to New York, but it was very disappointing then. The scene had changed, the rock era had started, and jazz was already beginning to be eclipsed. So we finally decided to move out. We went to California and we lived in Big Sur for 3 years, and that again was a marvelous experience, but a whole different life. We left New York and we went out to California. We spent 3 years in California. It was 1963 when we first arrived in Big Sur, and it was a paradise, and it still is, it's beautiful. But there were various difficulties. One is it was very hard to earn a living there, especially as a musician. And there seemed to be no future in it, except if somebody was independently wealthy. Maybe they'd made it in movies, maybe they'd made it I mean, I maybe have somewhat a jaundiced view of it, but there seems to be a whole strata of society that are involved in what I rather cynically call the pseudo-arts. People who could paint the kind of things where somebody says, look, that will fit my decor, I want that painting for this wall. And they could go to a place like Big Sur and live. But also, a successful writer could live in Big Sur. But a musician, particularly a jazz musician, unless I had been successful in a mega way, it was just a life of doing a few concerts here and there, doing things like clearing brush, gathering stone, working as a carpenter, washing up, working as a barman. So after 3 years, we saw no future in it. In fact, I mean, although I suppose people looked upon me as a hippie, I was dismayed by a lot of what I saw went on. There seemed to be a lack of any kind of natural morals as distinct from the sort of orthodox morals. I think a lot of natural morality comes out of a simple idea of, well, how would I like to be treated? And if you start to think about the way you may be treating somebody else, you think, well, would I like that? The natural morality comes out of that, I think. It was also along the line there, the Watts riots occurred in 1965, and there were similar riots, only on a smaller level, in San Francisco, which, by the way, were never publicized. And there was a kind of paranoia that swept Big Sur. So we decided to come back to Europe, because I knew the music scene, or thought I did, And I've often had part regrets about it, because England is not Europe as we know it. So it isn't that I'm harking back to a golden hippie age, because to me there was no such thing. Oh, I better stop. Okay, so. A bunch of us would go and drive up into New York State or northern New Jersey and camp by a lake and bring our instruments and play and swim, put baked potatoes in the fire and all that. And we used to have some great times like that, So the city jazz, the loft jazz that used to happen, that was part of it too, but also playing out in the wilds. And a lot of jazz musicians went out into the country and got away from the city. Places like New Hope, Pennsylvania became a sort of an area where people used to congregate, and musicians and artists. And Big Sur to a degree in the early 60s. So the move to Wales was, in a sense, to live a life which was more meaningful. Mid-Wales is one of the least populated areas of the British Isles, and we had found a particularly beautiful and beautifully located old farmhouse, which we spent time renovating, and is now, it's still like a family house. So a few years there was, it was an attempt to accommodate the longing to be in more natural conditions, and yet still be part of the scene. The dilemma was to keep that going. I found myself commuting weekly, so I would spend half my time in London teaching and playing, and the rest of the time in Wales, growing vegetables, maintaining the house, and trying to unwind from the city tension. It all happened really accidentally, because I'd had a recording studio in this room, and there was a lot of activity in that time. This was the late 70s. But then it got too noisy for the neighbours, you see. And so I was faced with either shutting down altogether or finding alternate premises. And a friend of mine had a little studio in that Hoxton Square area, and she said, oh, there's a building going in Hoxton Square, I think would suit you, you see. So I negotiated for it and duly bought it, and we opened then a 24-track studio in Hoxton Square. And then 6 months later, we shifted all the 16-track gear, and that's how it all started. It involved planning permission to turn these old warehouse buildings into studios, and while I was at it, I thought, well, what shall I do with the basement? And the idea was we would have a little club there, so that the two recording studios going, it would be a hangout for musicians. By 1984, the recording business in that way was beginning to decline. There were so many studios opening in London. But until that time, it was just absolutely chock-a-block, you know. We were just booked out. I could no longer spend time engineering. I had to hire engineers because it was just too much of a business to run. And at the same time, Wave was a small jazz label, which was how it started. And so we were releasing albums from time to time, and the bulk of the money came in through the recording, letting out the studios, you know. Late '83, an ex-student of mine, he had been working out in Zaire and Angola, and it got pretty difficult out there with the political situation. So he came back to England, and his idea was to open a club where he could put on some African music. So we pooled our resources, and the club then began to take shape. When we started, it was just the one building, and then the building at the back, at Coronet Street, that came onto the market. And so we went for that, purchased that building, and Bassclef actually came into being. And we ran like that for just over a year. He wanted some policy changes, and we couldn't see eye to eye, and so I bought him out. '89, when the recession hit, I felt I was laughing because we were earning very well, and there seemed to be no problem at all. One thing which may have been a mistake in retrospect and may not have been, but because the studios were doing far less work, we converted the second studio into what became Tenor-Clef, and that took most of our reserve. We were about 50,000 in the black. Although we were paying off the loans, we had that, you know, in the current account. And we were always able to pay everything on time, and it was fine. But we spent most of that reserve in converting the second studio into another venue. And then, because the recession hit, we found that the second venue didn't take off as well as it might have done. So we then began to find the beginning of lean times by 1990. The tangle of law that centers around bank borrowing and receivership and bankruptcy issues is exceedingly complex. All the while you're running the business, you might have some ideas of what you would need to do to safeguard yourself or try to safeguard your business should things not work out. But in fact, the law is so complicated that I found it was impossible to find out accurately the ramifications should the business get into financial trouble. I had used a country accountant who had been involved when I first formed Wave as a limited company, when we were living out in the Welsh Marches. I think, in retrospect, it got beyond him, and I gave him Bassclef work to do, and the whole thing got more than one small accountant could handle. But the first blow happened when Wave was struck off. simply because it hadn't sent the annual returns in time. As a result of that, the banks understandably said, this accountant's got to go. In principle, I had no argument against the banks appointing their own accountants. But what I didn't realize was the tremendous amount in terms of fees. And it's like administrative receivers, when they were appointed, they just bleed the thing to death. Right. Well, there's quite a lot I know too, you see, which complements what you say. And I have legal cases going ahead as well. Yeah, they can't, that's right, yeah, they can't use that or waive. And we're about to issue a writ to prevent that. Now, here's a thing that you may know, and it may fill in something. The demise of bass clef was a tragedy, both in terms of what it was doing for jazz music and also personally. I've learned a tremendous amount. I've learned a lot more about the way finance works, the hard aspect of finance, believing as I did that I could keep it going. I realized there were other agendas and that my view was not shared, certainly not by the banks, or for that matter, customs and excise. There was no way they were understanding that what I was running was something on a creative and artistic level, and was not concerned with making big bucks. For me, the reward was, as long as it made its way and gave me a reasonable living, it was the reward of producing what was a centre for the music in London. And what I created was something real. It may be forgotten in history, but that was an achievement for those 10 years. And I may go to the wall because life is not like that. It doesn't sort of reward an individual necessarily for what the individual's done. It's like the forces that govern the social reality, they're merciless. So I may go to the wall, but something real happened there, and some great music happened there. And some of it's recorded. And one of the things I regret is not having the opportunity at this point to be able to play and to give that way. It gives me a tremendous amount of strength, and I know it reaches other people, although it's a minority. Whereas if I play with other musicians, I can overcome that. If I'm on my own, I feel very sad about it. American way of life, from our vantage point, seemed looser, much more open. In those days, with such little travel and no air travel, as though you were leaving forever. It was like the old days going to Australia. You know, you never expected to see relatives for many, many years. So it was a bit scary. There was no problem in getting a visa. You just go to the American embassy, and the British quota was undersubscribed. So I arrived in New York. I was met by some friends, so that was helpful. You know, it wasn't quite so bad. They said, oh, we're living at this block here, this is a musician's block, and I got a little furnished room in that block with a lot of other musicians, and started to gig around, and the affluence was what was so amazing. I soon got myself a car. We toured New England over a weekend. I mean, I really traveled around that country, and it was so cheap to do so. 1944, and I was working up in town, and just a regular day gig. And I heard these sounds, and I was walking down Chancery, and I went into Lincoln's Inn Field, and there was the AFN band, led by Sam Donahue.
Right.
And all these guys in uniform, and all tapping their feet, and it was like unbelievable. It was a beautiful day, in the summer of '44, and they were all playing. It was just absolutely marvelous, and I couldn't get over it. And I guess it was been 1959, and I worked with Sam's band on some tours. And I said, you know, I heard you in London. He said, that concert in Lincoln's Inn Field? He said, yeah. He said, that was the only thing we did in England.
Wow.
And it was just that lunchtime concert.
Wow.
But I mean, that sparked me.
Yeah.
That's
all it
what I
takes,
wanted
isn't
to
it?
do. I mean, before I really sort of thought it out, how you're going to meet people, it was so amazing. And then also at that time, remember Matty Lee, when Glenn Miller's band first came on, and you turn on the radio, and we'd never heard anything like it.
No,
and it was live.
It was
Bobby Hackett and all those guys.
It was big. It was a big shift. This trio one morning, and I thought, hey, that's great, you know. Yeah. And I took notice of the trio's name, you see. And then another fellow who knows Peter and I saw him, and he said, hey, you want to hear Peter Innes? Yes. So he said, he's playing with Jose. I said, well, I heard them the other morning on the radio.
But it only takes that one spark to light the fire, doesn't it? I mean,
but he was great. He came to my house, and I remember it to this day. I got Ray Brown's one bass hit, and he played this one bass hit with it. I couldn't hear the bass on the record because it was exactly, he played the bit.
You didn't hear things like basses on records in those days, did you?
That's right.
Drag him over the field to get the speaker.
Trying to hear it, they always recorded it so quietly, didn't they? They never gave it any kind of real presence, you know. That's the thing about jazz, though, isn't it? I mean, it's like we're all helpless because we know about the economics of the thing. I mean, it's hopeless. You know, you're never going to make any money out of, playing jazz, but you're helpless to do anything about it once it gets you. Right. You're just lost in it. That's it. Your life is ruined from that day on. Economically,
Is it coffee time? Yeah. what happens is that in clubland, you've got to run large venues. So you can bring in the multinational talents. You can charge because everybody thinks this is great. And necessarily they equate someone who's got a big image with great creative and artistic ability. So unfortunately, in this world, in terms of creative talent, especially as far as jazz is concerned, the ones that I rate the highest are virtually unknown. It wasn't always that way. In the 30s, oftentimes the musicians that were known the best because they had the respect of other musicians and the word spread outward like ripples. That began to change with the advent of MCA and Joe Glazer. When I was working in New York, he said to me, we want to make you a star. He said, you stick with me, kiddo, and it'll be all right. Now, at that time, I was in the midst of feeling that I needed to know a lot more. I was a good player, but I wanted to develop more, and I turned it down. And that was really the turning point. Now, turning it down meant that I did develop, and have developed constantly, even over recent years. It's a constant learning process, and I'm pleased with that. But if I had gone their way, I may have made a much bigger name for myself, and maybe I would have developed anyway. I don't know, but I made my choice, you know. What's the person after? Does he want his name up in lights? Does he want a great reputation and lots of money? Or does that person love the music sufficiently to actually get into it? And unfortunately, most of the musicians who love the music and really get into it remain relatively on the sidelines. It's unfortunate. I think that's happened to me. I've sort of stayed on the sidelines. And I would like to be more successful, but where I feel my strength is that ability. For example, I know instinctively with my whole being that no one in the world plays bass like I do. There's so many different ways. I'm not saying that this is the way, but at least I've reached that core of creativity in myself, and that gives me my strength. Whether or not they make me bankrupt, they can't take that away, you know. One of the negative results of just money orientation is the manufacture of vast amounts of cheap and shoddy goods. And this takes materials from our environment, often things that were growing, like trees and so forth. And instead of turning them into objects of beauty and things that last, it's like things that can sell, maybe cheaply, but need to be replaced frequently. The individuality that I see means broadening my perspective by learning more, not just in an intellectual sense, but understanding more, making more of a feeling contact with history, and also trying to evaluate where we're going and separate where we're going that's going to be a dead end from that which has the seeds of a continuity of a much deeper experience even than we know now. I have an archive of taped jazz, which I think represents a slice of history in jazz as well. I would love to have done more, and in retrospect I wished I had somehow managed to do more recording. The archive goes back to the middle 50s, the period when I was living and working in New York, when I had my own studio, and there's some wonderful music from that time. And my artistic ambition now is to make some of this wonderful music available, and hopefully to a worldwide audience. It merits it. There are some beautiful things. music has not come to me easy. I've worked very, very hard. But when you know something, you just know it. You know, it's your strength. And the strength I have is what I've achieved in that realm. One of the things I think of in terms of my relation to music is that I know how I can express myself. I know what I've learned in terms of musical structure and harmony and the discipline that's needed to create jazz, particularly jazz on a sequence. And not just to run through the changes, but to actually create in that idiom. And I know the discipline that's involved in that, and to get beyond, so that you've got the discipline and you go beyond and you actually create. So I can't be the arbiter on all the things that are happening. And also, because there's so much to listen to, it's impossible anyway, but at least I know my own strength in what I can do. But one of the things I think of in those terms is Johann Sebastian Bach wrote in that Baroque manner at a time when it was at its end. So he was, toward the end of his life, put down as being rather old hat. With the era of Mozart and Beethoven, the new music was coming in and Bach's music was discarded pretty much. By the middle of the 19th century, Felix Bartholdy Mendelssohn discovered or rediscovered Bach. And it took 100 years after his bringing musicians to the attention of this music before Bach's star rose to the point it is now. And even when I was in school in the 30s, Bach was looked upon as a rather obscure and not major composer. So what I think is, if something is good, if it's on the side of light and not on the side of darkness, it will eventually surface, it will resurface, it will have its function in due course in time. And so my belief is that for my own personal evolution, to come to grips with music has been very important for me and a big stabilizer and a big learning experience. And having devoted myself very diligently to it, I feel that I have something to give and have given something in music, in the particular idiom in jazz.
All right.